You read Stephen Spender's diaries of being a fireman in London at that point and elsewhere. All this stuff about British pluck and so on, I mean, I'm wedded to it, okay, and believe me. But it's very, very overdone. People were really, really flaking. Now, at that point, you say, well, what else? Look, we know the Nazis are trying for horror weapons. What's on the next damn rocket? What do we know is coming? Maybe it'll be gas. Maybe it'll be germs. We don't know. What we do know is we're going to flatten anywhere which can launch one of those damn rockets. And that we are entitled to anything. That's how people are going to think if they're fought in this way. This was Germany, not Germany, but Hitler, urging suicide on his people.
Let me add a couple of things to what Hitchens just said there. It may be right, this point about shortening the war thing was a post facto justification. It did happen, though, that Truman wrote a letter on the 9th of August, the day of the second bomb, in which he said, we will take all measures necessary to reduce the number of our own military casualties. So that point was put that early, in a letter which in other respects is full of weasel expressions like, I'm doing my utmost to ensure that there are no, we minimize civilian casualties and so on. This was written on the 9th of August. So there is that point. Hitch is right, the Germans didn't build big bombers. What they did was they concentrated their efforts on building guided missiles. It was Theodor Adorno, one of the pluses on our side in this exchange,
Absolutely.
Who said, you can tell that the human race has got cleverer over time, but not wiser, because of the development from the spear into the guided missile. Well, the first guided missile was fired off in the summer of 1944. It was kept in reserve for when the invasion happened. And then there was this summer campaign, summer and into the early autumn of 1944, that the V1s and V2s were coming over and causing devastation in London particularly, and one or two other places. The V1, the doodlebug, you could hear it. And then when the engine cut out, you knew it was going to fall and everybody held their breaths. But the V2, you couldn't hear. You didn't know it was coming until it exploded. And the old lady who lives across the road from me, and I talk in my book about the bomb site across the road from my house, and right next to it is a lady now in her late 80s who was in that house one day when a V2 fell a couple of blocks away. And she tells this story about how she was standing at the window at the kitchen sink, looking through the window, and her little son was playing on the lawn outside, and this terrific explosion went off, and she realized it was a V2, so she ran out to see if her son was okay, and he was absolutely fine, but she wasn't, because the window had been blown in. She was streaming blood, and her little son was traumatized by the vision of this woman streaming blood, screaming at him and running like this with her arms held wide, so you can just imagine how absolutely awful it is. But the V attack had petered out more or less by the autumn of 1944, partly because it was interdicted. There were attacks on the launch sites, but also because the number that the Germans had of them wasn't very great. And it's an interesting fact that in the autumn of 1944, Arthur Harris got back command of Bomber Command. It had been under Eisenhower's charge since before the D-Day landings, and had done a fantastic job, which Harris always claimed he could never do, of tactical bombing of supplies and the German army in France, and railheads and bridges and so on. And he got it back, and between the autumn of 1944 and the 25th of April 1945, when the bombing campaign was stood down, Arthur Harris had dropped more bombs on Germany than in the whole of the war beforehand. And he had a list of cities, and they included gems like Fort Simon, Hildesheim and Würzburg and others, that were bombed, and the people who lived in them just could not understand why.
Because he could.
Because he could, that's exactly the point, yeah.
The next question is this gentleman here in the white shirt, and then we're going to go up to the back for a question after that.
I'd like to make two brief factual points. The first one, both of you mentioned that Hamburg was the center of the German working class, the implication being that a lot of good people died in the firebombing of Hamburg. I think it's worth mentioning in this connection that Hamburg also was the home of Police Battalion 101, which is described by Christopher Browning in his harrowing description of how the mass killing of Jews took place, the killing of women, children by mass shootings, thousands of victims being shot by these good people from Hamburg every day. Now, the second point is more important. According to the man in charge of German war production, Speer, there was a degrading effect as a result of the area bombing of German cities. And Speer gives figures that so many more planes could have been produced and so many more tanks could have been produced and so forth. I'm not prepared to argue that this is decisive, that this is a matter of end justifying means and so forth, but I think it should become part of the moral calculus and therefore it is wrong simply to say the area bombing was at no utility at all, possibly it was even counterproductive and so forth. The facts are it had some effect, and that should be taken into account.
Anthony?
On that second point, I think, when Speer was in prison before the Nuremberg trials, he was invited by an Allied commission to come and talk to them about production during the war. And he astonished them by saying that until the end of 1944, production was on the up. He made the point to an audience that wanted to hear it, that it wasn't rising as fast as he would have liked. Yes, that takes account of that point. But the fact of the matter is that it was rising. He complained that Hitler never allowed him to put the economy on a total war footing because Hitler had this anxiety about what had happened in 1919 when the German economy couldn't provide cigarettes and flower pots and things like that to the German people who were annoyed about it because lots of shortages occurred because of this transfer of productive capacity to other ends. And so he never allowed it. And it turned out never to be necessary anyway because of the enormous resources that were available. And it was the bottleneck things, the oil, the coal, the transport, that in the end scuppered it. And it was in January 1945 that Speer wrote to Hitler and said, the war is over from the production point of view because I just now can't get the resources together to do it. In the book, by the way, I quote how the Germans dealt with bombing damage. I talk in particular about the 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne in 1942, how many millions of cigarettes and sheets and pints of milk and loaves of bread were on the autobahns going into Cologne within days of the bombing raid, how short a time it took to rehouse people, partly because the Germans knew that since they were going to start the war, they made preparations for it very early, beginning 1935 or 36, but also because they had these massive manpower resources that never affected their military capacity. On the day that the war ended in Europe, the day that Berlin fell, there were 10 million men of military age in the Wehrmacht between the ages of 18 and 35, all with boots on and all with guns in their hands.
But you do say, I personally regard Albert Speer as a pathological liar. He was always trying to please different audiences, but he did say, after the bombing of Hamburg, he said another half dozen such raids would cripple Germany's war production. That's what he thought then. But this is subjective. He later discovers that's not true. That's right. He could have been panicked. It might have been worth trying to stampede a few other people. Mention of these staunch fellows in their jackboots, it compels me to say again, Speer's empire of production, which included, I think I'm right in saying, the factories that built the rocket weapons and other places, was a slave empire. These were not Germans working. Yeah. They were slaves from Russia and Poland and Yugoslavia and Greece and elsewhere. I'm in favor of the liberation of slaves, okay, whatever it takes. And I think it can be something you have to undertake in a hurry. You're certainly morally obliged to undertake it in a hurry. And those whose manpower and well-being, all the cigarettes you can get, and so on, depend upon slavery, have made a pact upon which they may be called to witness. Sorry to sound like a preacher, but there it bloody well is. And those slaves were liberated before they could be exterminated or before they could be worked to death. And I think this really must be part of what you call the calculus. So
I'm alerted by, if I may, I'm terribly sorry, alerted by a phrase.
We're dying of politeness here.
Whatever it takes, that phrase that Hitch uses there. We agree.
By any means necessary is the traditional slogan.
Yeah, okay, by any means necessary.
By any means necessary.
And also by any means effective, I've got to say, because somebody sent me an email shortly after my book came out in the UK, a professor of economics at St Andrews University, and he said to me, I find your book incredibly interesting. I'd just like to let you know that there's quite a bit of discussion about what would have happened if the whole bombing effort of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force had been focused on industrial and military targets. If the RAF had really backed up the United States Army Air Force on this one, he said the war could have been 2 years shorter if they'd done that. That's a fantastic thought, if correct. But of course it's a post facto surmise about it. But it suggests something, which is that the area bombing, the attacks on civilian populations, were not part of what was necessary. They were not necessary to winning the war. And that, in a way, if any sense attaches to the idea of potentiating the degree of moral criminality of an act, it just makes things worse. That it wasn't really having any, that it was marginal, and yet it caused this